Awesome. Okay. Um, so how I would frame this is this whole week, this convention, we've been focused on this concept of cooperation, right? This idea that, we have the social intelligence as a human species. But what this presentation is going to explore is really there's an idea that exists in kind of direct contrast to that says that actually human beings are quite selfish. This is our core nature, and it's that competition is what drives human society forward. And I think we should take this idea seriously for two reasons. One is because this is probably the most commonly held view by most people today. And second, this is really the idea that is used to justify a lot of the structures of global capitalism. This is why we're told we need deregulated free markets. It's the best way to allocate, human competition, and so forth. And so, in order to dismantle these kinds of beliefs, I think it's really important to understand where they come from, where these ideas sort of how did we inherit these ideas? And that's a big part of what we're going to get into. Before I kind of introduce the scope of what we'll cover, I want to just set some context. I'm going to kind of foreshadow a few things. And the way I'm going to do that is I want to go back to 2001. And one of the most famous, well known sort of scandals in corporate America. I know many of you are probably familiar with the Enron story. For those that are not, Enron was in the early 2000s, this incredibly famous company, hugely successful, earning, $100 billion of revenue every year. The leadership team were on the cover of magazines. Fortune named them the most innovative company 6 years in a row in the United States, until it was discovered the entire company was essentially one giant uh, deliberate accounting fraud. And among them, the many horrifying details that emerged about this scandal, it actually came out that at the time, California was experiencing a range of these energy crises. They were experiencing rolling blackouts. Power stations were going down. And what was discovered several years later is that part of the reason for this is that Enron traders, employees, were basically convincing these power stations to create these artificial maintenance sort of checks when they weren't needed during peak usage times. So they could inflate the price of energy and they could make huge profits. And again, this millions of people suffered these rolling blackouts. This affected hospitals and nursing homes, right? So one of the questions that everyone looked into after this Enron scandal came out was, well, how did we get here? And to understand the culture at Enron, it's important to understand the culture that was put into the company by the CEO. This is Jeffrey Skilling. Went to prison. I think he only just got out of prison very recently. And so Jeffrey Skilling at Enron was famous for instituting this fairly well-known, very um, uh, sort of challenging performance management system, very controversial. And so the way it was called rank and yank, that's what the employees called it. Basically, what they did is every few quarters, they would rank all Enron employees based on performance. And then the top, 15% would get a raise, they'd get a promotion. And the bottom 10% were fired immediately. No questions asked. And as you can imagine, the culture that this put into the company, it was incredible amount of paranoia. It eroded any concept of collaboration, teamwork. Everyone was terrified of their coworker. Everyone was seen as the enemy, even within the company. And so people went and they asked, Skilling, like, where did you get the idea for this concept? And it turns out that he got the idea from this book. He calls it his favorite book. If you're familiar, this is Richard Dawkins. He wrote The Selfish Gene. I imagine many of you are familiar with this book. If you're not, this is probably one of the most influential science books of the last, several decades. The Royal Society in the UK, for example, is like super famous institution, named it the most influential book of science ever. So that's like above Charles Darwin's, on the origin of species. So later in the talk, we're going to unpack. So basically what Dawkins is arguing is that it's the gene is the central driver of evolution, which is of course true, right? Genetics, our genes are involved in evolution, but there's a few things that Dawkins it's dangerously incomplete set of ideas. He doesn't understand there are other mechanisms that drive human evolution. And so because of this, just to get a sense of the core argument from this book, I'll read this kind of summarizes. So Dawkins writes, if you wish, as I do, to build a society in which individuals cooperate generously and unselfishly, you can expect little help from biological nature. So as you can imagine, this kind of thinking has provided a lot of sort of scientific credibility to a worldview that unfortunately has become very pervasive, very common in the world. And so over the last, since the 1970s, I would say, especially in the United States, there's this cultural movement in culture, but also in economics and politics that usually was referred to as neoliberalism. You can see it reflected, if you know Ayn Rand, she wrote a book called Atlas Shrugged, hugely famous, basically promoting these libertarian ideas. We're all islands of individual activity. And then economists like Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek. Milton Friedman, the guy on the right we're going to hear from in a moment, still taught in business schools. I went to business school, still learned Milton Friedman's ideas, sort of really core to the worldview many people have. And then, of course, starting in the 1970s, we had, Reagan in the US, Margaret Thatcher. One of the social scientists that I'll refer to later basically calls this era that we've been living in like a giant social experiment that asks the question, like, what if society were run on a principle of hyper individualism, like the extreme, like, individualism that actually celebrates greed? And we see this also expressed. If you're familiar with, Wall Street, the Gordon Gekko character, this character, who proclaims like greed is good, greed is a good thing, it's how the world works. This character actually comes very much from the ideas of a very famous economist, Milton Friedman. And I want to play this clip. It's 1 minute long, just because I think it's helpful to really hear from the person that kind of gives expression to this worldview that really informs, the culture that we're all living in, especially in the West. So this is from the late 70s, the Phil Donahue show, who had Milton Friedman on his show. So we tested the sound. Here we go. I'm going to come give Dharmendra a big high five if this works.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power with it, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on? Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Well, of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and learned.
Okay, so I love giving presentations here because I know I don't have to convince any of you that pretty much everything he just said in this video is like almost all of it is wrong. And so we're gonna break this apart as we go through this presentation. But this, this informs. This is kind of mainstream thinking in most, business schools, in politics certainly. So a question that we should have is, where does Milton Friedman get his ideas? Where does he get his credibility for making these kinds of claims? And very often, one of the places that he will turn is to an 18th century Scottish philosopher named Adam Smith. Again, I imagine many of you are familiar with Adam Smith. For those that are not, the way I think of Adam Smith is kind of like the Taylor Swift of economics history. Like he's just the most famous one. And the reason he's so famous is he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, which is seen as kind of this like foundational text of like modern economics. And so Adam Smith is known mostly for two things. One is this concept of the invisible hand, right? This is a concept that basically argues that, free markets are the best way to allocate scarce resources in a society. It's, better than any kind of planning, no matter what kind of governance planning you're talking about. And the second thing that he's most famous for is this quote from The Wealth of Nations. He writes, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from regard to their own interest." Okay, so here's the thing about Adam Smith. I'm going to come back at the very end of this presentation and spend a bit of time. Adam Smith is really misunderstood in the world today. That quote that I just showed you is taken out of context. I'll come back to that. The first thing, I'll just say this now. Adam Smith is known as an economist, but economics as a field as we know it today didn't even exist for 100 years after Adam Smith died. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. Most of his work was focused on exploring the moral obligations that we have to other people. And it was within that context that he wrote Wealth of Nations, which is more of a book of a philosophy, but it became a foundational text of economics. So we'll explain that more. There's one final thing I want to say before I kind of get into the core of this presentation, which is this debate that we've kind of been having, partially this week, and we have it broadly outside of this convention. This question of, are humans really selfish and driven by competition, or are we selfless? We work through cooperation. This debate, this question is not new. Humanity has been having this discussion for thousands and thousands of years. During the Enlightenment, several hundred years ago, this question was framed really as a moral question, like, are humans naturally good or are we evil? So my question, I think something we should be reflecting on or thinking about is, if it's the case that for hundreds, even thousands of years, many people just like us, we're not alone in this room arguing that humans are actually quite cooperative. We're a socially cooperative species. Then why is it that we're still so stuck with these, rigid systems of hierarchy and exploitation and the governance structures? One of the things that I really want to argue in this presentation is part of the reason why we're so stuck actually has to do with a story that we've been telling ourselves, that we still tell today. It's a story that we still tell our children. It's like the common story we tell in schools. It's the common story that anthropology departments at almost every global university. And it's a story, it's a story that says, at one time we were these primitive hunter-gatherers, crawling around in the forest looking for food. And then one day we invented farming, the agricultural revolution. And when we invented farming, we formed, tribes that became chiefdoms, and we introduced private property, and we need security. And then, the rise of the nation state. And we've, experienced this rigid development of social progress. What I want to show in this presentation is that story, one, we now know is most likely wrong. It's actually not sort of how human society developed. And two, that story was handed down to us by a group of elite conservatives in the 18th century Enlightenment as a response to a set of very surprisingly consistent criticisms they were receiving from Native American indigenous communities that they were coming into contact with in the New World. And so I'm actually curious, how many of you are familiar with this book or have read it, Sapiens? Yeah, so it's super popular, right? Barack Obama put it on his, books of the year. I think there's a copy upstairs, actually, I saw. So unfortunately, it's stories like this one that Harari tells us that continues to perpetuate this, this very, traditional story that this is how human societies evolve. And we now know that I'm not completely disregarding the entire book. Like, we shouldn't go upstairs and like burn it. There's still value in the book, but there, unfortunately, this part of it, this narrative, we know is wrong. And we're going to go through how we got here, what it means for this debate we've been having. Again, I think in order to overcome these ideas, we should know where they came from. Then I want to introduce kind of like what the learning, like what is the latest in anthropology and archaeology saying to us about the story of human history. And then you'll know when I get to that third final section that I only have about 5 minutes left, because it's a very short section. So that's just to keep in mind. And just practically, what does that mean for PROUT? Like, how do we actually tell a better story going forward? Okay, so how did we get here? So I'm going to start the story by going back to 17th and 18th century Western Europe during the Enlightenment, where, and I'm going to oversimplify a bit, but basically all of our modern political philosophies can be sourced back to these two fairly, well-known, famous Enlightenment thinkers, Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And I'll start with Hobbes because basically, if you want someone to be angry at about this narrative that humanity, that we're selfish, this is kind of the guy we should be mad at, like we should blame. Very pessimistic view of human nature. He's the one, if you're familiar with this quote, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Like, the state of nature is violent, and it's, this reason we need like strong governments, almost like authoritarian, states to control our, base instincts of violence. And then you have on the other side, you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, kind of the opposite view, very, not as pessimistic, who says people in their natural state are basically good. But this natural innocence, unfortunately, it's corrupted by the evils of society, right? This is kind of the two options on the menu within, the Enlightenment. And again, oversimplifying, but this is kind of, you can kind of source back the modern political ideological spectrum between like the conservative right versus the, progressive liberal left. Like this is the birth of sort of modern political philosophy. Now, which of these two stories really won out in Western Europe, right? Like that's the question we want to explore. So to go back to address that, we kind of need to go back to a very consequential moment in the story of European history, which was the discovery of North and South America, the new world, where they, for the first time, came into contact with these, Native Americans, indigenous tribes. This was a huge moment in Western Europe. This was, and there's it really can't be overstated, like how much documented recorded interactions that, this is the Dutch, the Spanish, the French we're going to talk about, the English, they learned the language of these indigenous communities. They, spent a lot of time interacting. One of the most common observations, and this is all across all of these Western European societies, was this observation that these communities were actually incredibly intelligent and, in particular, very persuasive in their speaking skills. They were very good public speakers. This is just a quote from a Jesuit priest from the 17th century who writes in his journal. This is a real quote he wrote in his journal. As regards to their intelligence, they are in no way inferior to Europeans. I would have never believed that without instruction, nature could have supplied a most ready and vigorous eloquence. Now, I'll explain why this matters in a moment. And to do that, I want to focus in particular on one community of indigenous Native Americans called the Wendat. They lived in what is present day, like Quebec, I think, like Canada. And in particular, most of their interactions with Western Europe were with the French. So French colonies, French colonialists. And this figure, well, this is not him, but one figure in particular was a person named Candiaronk. He was like this top philosopher, like a leader in their community. And Candiaronk became widely known in Western Europe, and you'll understand why in a moment, for having like a very persuasive eloquence. He was a very good public speaker. And Candiaronk spent a lot of time with the French. There's actually some evidence that he may have actually gone to France himself. And if he didn't, there were other Wendat ambassadors that spent time in France. And so you can kind of summarize Candiaronk's views. He sort of developed these views of what he found in European society. The first thing he said was that he was really unimpressed with the European style of debate. And that may sound trivial, but the reason why these Native American communities very often were such good public speakers is their entire governance system was built on public debate, right? And so speaking in front of a group, they made, an opportunity for every voice to be heard, presumably. And he found that, in Western society, people shouted over each other, only the loudest voices were heard. That was one of his critiques. Second was he was appalled by the treatment of women, in particular, in Western Europe, where women, were essentially treated like property, where in Wendat society, they had political status, they had, self-sovereignty, they were able to divorce if, were in a bad, partnership. And the third, and maybe most important one, is they were really horrified by the Western European tendency to exhibit almost like this blind submission to these systems of hierarchy, this blind submission, very often to the king, right? This one person. And the reason was in Wendat society, there was no way to convert material wealth into any kind of political power, right? And so broadly, they found Western society quite, ungenerous. They found people being left to live in poverty and destitute while others, lived in opulence. They found that quite, horrifying. Now, how is it that his ideas became so well known in Western Europe is because in the book on the left, so there was a French soldier named Louis Armand de la Hontan who spent a lot of time with Candiaronk, and he recorded a lot of his conversations and packaged them into a memoir that became a bestseller. Pretty much, you could imagine, all the intellectuals and the common people of Europe were reading it. And I show the book on the left because it was another very popular one that came from Peru, so Spanish colonies. And really, this broadly became known as what is now referred to as the Indigenous critique, right? This essentially this broader movement where Europeans, for the first time, were confronted with views of their society from an outside observer. And you could kind of think of it like these books became almost like the Oprah's book club of the time. Everyone was reading them. They were incredibly popular. So this presented a bit of a problem for the noble elites of Europe at the time, right? They're not happy about this. This is bad news. The common people are waking up to, the structures of hierarchy. And so this is where you could imagine, like if you could go back to 18th century and turn on Fox News, you would have heard, a bunch of angry, conservatives talking about, well, first they'd be talking about Thomas Hobbes a lot and how, we need strong states. Why are we listening to these, indigenous communities, et cetera? And so just to connect this briefly to the chronology of how we got to the modern day, I know Sohail talked about Herbert Spencer, but really the next big moment in this story was when Charles Darwin discovered evolution by natural selection. And most of us, we know this term survival of the fittest. Most people associate that to Darwin. I know Sohail mentioned this. That was a quote from this person, Herbert Spencer, who essentially what he did is he sort of misinterpreted a lot of Darwin's concepts and applied it just broadly beyond the scope of relevance to all of human psychology, all of humanity, and really associated this survival of the fittest with strength and power rather than adaptability, which is what Darwin was talking about. This really could be its own full presentation. We're not going to spend time on this, but I can't really overstate how popular Spencer's ideas became in Europe, especially in the 19th and 20th century. Like in its most extreme form, this was essentially the, like the racial ideology of like Nazism. In its less extreme form, this is, a worldview that many industrialists, capitalists in the United States during the Gilded Age felt. And actually in the US, social Darwinism kind of fell out of favor for a long time. I was talking to Ananta the other day where the tax rate in the US used to be at like 90% on the wealthiest Americans. And, this dates back to like the New Deal, World War II. But unfortunately, social Darwinian ideas have come back very strongly since essentially this era of neoliberalism. And of course, we get, the Enron story that I started with, where, survival of the fittest, about strength and power. And if actually you help the weak, it's, you're just harming your own organization. That's the view. Okay. I want to go back to this moment because there's something else that happened here that is really important to understand, where the sort of wealthy European elites responding to this indigenous critique, this idea that Native Americans were horrified by their society. And I have to introduce this person. So this is someone, his name's AJR Turgot. Don't know what the AJR, I do. It's a long name. I'll just call him Turgot. So he's an Enlightenment figure, and he was very familiar with these books I mentioned. He'd read, in particular, the Diaries of a Peruvian Woman, the book on the right I showed. And his argument essentially was the freedom and equality of, and he calls it, of savages is not a sign of their superiority. It's a sign of inferiority, since it is only possible in a society where everyone is equally poor. So basically his argument, what he's saying is like, why are we listening to these people? Like they live in mud huts, they like gather berries in the forest. Like we're Europeans, we have technology, we have material wealth, right? So what happens next? And I'm going to take just a 2-minute detour to kind of introduce something that is a very Western tendency, sort of like a very Western way of thinking about reality, which is in Western knowledge systems, we very often like to invoke these like external, objective, universal truths. This was essentially, if anyone was at my PROUT talk last year, this was basically the whole concept of my talk last year, which is that, it's like I used the analogy of a fish swimming in water where you don't even know what water is, and I'll use intelligence as the example. It's very easy to make the case. It should be obvious, right? Like humans are the most intelligent species on the planet, right? And that's a very common way of thinking of it. The problem with this is that intelligence is this like literally infinitely irreducible. There's an infinite number of ways to define like what intelligence is. Like how do you actually measure intelligence? And so, when you see something like this, what gets missed is that you have to make choices, like this editorial subjective choices of, well, intelligence is based on who uses tools to manipulate their environment, who has spatial memory, spatial reasoning. It's like, oh, well, those are very human things. So like, oh, what a surprise. Humans are the most intelligent species on the planet, right? Like, and you could, again, it's an infinitely irreducible concept. And essentially what Turgot did is he did that, but for society. He basically said, well, there's actually a hierarchy of like more advanced and less advanced societies. And of course, what he looked at is, well, how do you measure how advanced the society is? Well, we have technology, we have material wealth, right? Well, what a surprise. Then we're going to find Western Europe at the, at the top of this hierarchy. And so, and again, to get a sense of the argument that he put forward from this way of thinking, he writes, we progress from simple societies like those of the Wendat to our own complex commercial civilization in which the poverty and dispossession of some, however lamentable, is the necessary condition for the prosperity of society as a whole. So essentially what he's saying here is, yeah, like inequality is bad. We don't love it, but, there's really no other way, right? This is just the price you pay for, it being on a more advanced society, right? And keep in mind, the thing they miss is that how advanced the society is not this, external, objective, universal concept that Western knowledge systems tend to invoke. And so here, really, you get the birth of what became this narrative that we still tell this story today, this like simple progression from hunter-gatherers to tribes to chiefs to states, etc. And it's, again, so popular, we teach it to kids and, global bestsellers that, all across the political spectrum, we still perpetuate this idea, this view. Turgot's ideas really became sort of the dominant view in universities since that time. Okay. So what are we learning today? What's changing? What is the evidence starting to reveal to us? And where I want to go back, I really want to stress, like, what's the problem with this story? Like, what is this story actually doing that's harmful to us? And I really want to be clear about this. Um, is and keep in mind, pretty much everyone in Western Europe, no matter where on this political spectrum you fell, bought into this idea of social progress, that, technology and material wealth is a sign of how advanced we are as a civilization. So I'm going to ignore Hobbes. Let's see what Rousseau, like, what did Rousseau think of these ideas from Turgot? And here Rousseau writes, human nature never makes a retrograde step. Once forsaken, our lost innocence can no longer be regained. That primitive society must have arisen in the happiest and most stable of epochs. Okay, so there's two things happening in this quote that I think are worth mentioning. The first is I kind of think of this quote as it's basically like the shrug emoji of, like social activism. It's like, well, we invented farming, nothing we can do now. Like, what a shame. It must have been, how fun it must have been to be one of these like primitive, innocent, people from the before times. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is this quote is a really good expression of today. It's what's known as like the myth of the noble savage. This tendency that we tend to romanticize, these primitive people as, somehow simple and, innocent. And, he's kind of stripping them of their intellect, of their capacity for, self-intentional direction. I haven't made this point yet, and I want to make it really clearly now, is Rousseau is kind of falling into the trap that conservatives today love to catch progressive liberals fall into, which I think is fair, which is the argument of this presentation is not that, oh, like these indigenous communities were great and wonderful and Western Europeans were bad, right? It's not the argument. The argument is, and again, like these indigenous communities in their were not like beacons of Yama and Niyama that we should all like aspire to. They had their own forms of, brutality and violence and so forth. So it's not about like celebrating Native Americans at the, evil. It's not that simple. But because this is a trap that Rousseau is falling into. So if this is not the story, then if this is not how it was, what is the story? And to introduce that, I'm going to reference this book, which I would argue instead of reading Sapiens, I would recommend reading this one instead. This came out in 2021. This actually informs like a huge amount of the research in this presentation. And it was kind of a big deal. So Graeber and Wenger, they're two natural scientists, I guess. One's an archaeologist, one's an anthropologist. This is kind of the closest thing that academics can get to like a Taylor Swift album release. It got like huge amount of critical reception. And the reason it was such a big deal is basically what they did is they went and aggregated all of the research across all of these different social sciences, buried deeply in academic journals that none of us in this room are reading, right? To try to figure out, to paint a better picture. What is the emerging science telling us about the story of human history? And I'll share kind of two core takeaways of the book. The first is hunter-gatherer societies were not primitive in the sense that we, use that word. These were incredibly intelligent. They had very deliberate, sophisticated, in some sense, governance structures. They were very politically self-aware about the social systems that they were instituting, even in their own, hunter-gatherer societies. And there's evidence of very complex governance structures. And I think the reason that matters is think about the way that we've sort of absorbed ideas about, in the United States, like Native Americans. Like this is a cartoon that was still on. Oh, sorry, did I go past it? See if it works. So this is a cartoon that was still on TV in the 90s, like when I was a kid. Like I grew up watching, like this was our view. This is how we're taught to, like these native communities were like these simple buffoons, like primitive societies. Like we stripped them of their capacity for intellect. These were very intelligent people that had, again, like deliberate and intentional structures of their own, how they structured their own society. So that's the first thing. The second thing this book argues, and it's really interesting, is that there was really no such thing as the agricultural revolution in the way that we kind of understand it today. The evidence appears to be showing that farming was invented really over like thousands of years, in different ways, and that it didn't inevitably lead to this like private property with, the need for security and, hierarchy and domination. There's tons and tons of different social structures that emerged alongside the invention of farming. He spends a lot of time, they spent a lot of time focusing on, in present day Mexico, there was a place called Teotihuacan that had hundreds of thousands or 100,000 or so people, like huge urban centers with no evidence of any leader or, ruler or king or whatever, this decentralized society. And the reason this book, I think, should be exciting to us in this room as proutists is really what this is pointing at, is that human history is really full of far more like experimentation in the way we can structure, a society. That humanity is really they refer to it as like a carnival parade of experiments and governance structures. And so we should feel empowered that it doesn't have to be the way society doesn't have to be the way that, this Turgot, social hierarchy tells us that it's rigid and fixed. And so I think that's why this is a big deal. Now, I want to do an experiment. This is a video. I made this to basically bring to life the story that I just told, to try and make it a little more accessible. I want to be clear, just like disclaimer, I made this with AI, okay? This is not real footage from the 17th, 18th century. And so I'll please also just like give me some space to like, so this is like French, like we should hear more French accents than we're gonna hear. I'm pretty sure we'll hear every accent but French. So just, I'll play the video. Hopefully this like brings to life like the narrative and the story that I've just shared with you.
Hey everyone, just made it to the New World. There's a whole group of locals standing on the shore. No idea how they're gonna take us showing up like this. Wish us luck. We've started spending time in the Wendat village, and everything's shared, no locks, no hoarding. Families all under one roof, long houses.
So they're holding one of their public debates. They are incredibly well-spoken. There's no shouting over each other. Everyone listens.
The Wendat have been spending time with us now, and they're not impressed. One of them asked why we let our own go hungry while others hoard supplies. All right, big moment. This is Candiaronc. He's basically their top thinker, speaker, philosopher, you name it. We've been talking for hours. He's tearing our whole world apart. I'm back in France now, and my journals about Candiaronc, they're everywhere. I've got publishers sending me letters. I'm a celebrity.
No one can stop talking about this book about the Wendat philosopher. Okay. My friend Claudine actually quoted it at a wedding. Okay. Everyone is so obsessed.
Okay, I just finished the book. This Wendat, he's describing a world where kindness isn't rare and no one lives in poverty. It's very thought-provoking.
This book is dangerous. Civilization is not a council of voices. It is hierarchy, structure, order. Without that, what are...
This guy says these ideas from the New World are too dangerous to go unanswered. He's been writing his theory of social progress. Civilization moves forward in only one direction.
Okay, we're out here handing out pamphlets on our ideas about social progress. Societies evolve, and it's a ladder, and we're at the top. Great news, everyone. The university will now teach our ideas. Young minds will know the truth that civilization evolves upward on a ladder of progress.
Hey fam, today in our anthropology class, we're learning about the evolution of human societies, from hunter-gatherer bands to tribes to kingdoms.
So basically, hunter-gatherers form tribes, then chiefdoms, then us. Guess that's just how progress works.
I'm excited for summer break. I'm probably going to read that new book Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg listed on their books of the year. I think it's called Sapiens.
Yeah, it was a long year of shooting, post-production, editing. The actors were terrible to work with. It was tough. All the travel, yeah, expenses have to be paid. Yeah, I'm actually going to come back to this. Well, there's the third section. I'll come back to a little bit about the tools available to us to start telling better stories. And this is, again, this is very new AI system that is coming online. Okay. Now, I have just two short parts left in the presentation. Okay, so now what I want to do, I want to connect back to where we started with this, where did Richard Dawkins kind of steer us wrong? What's sort of the flaw? Like, what is he missing from his theory of like invoking the gene as like the driver of evolution? And so there's this big misconception that a lot of conservatives, it's actually very common that people will sort of invoke as, sort of why human society should be the way it is. And they'll point at, other primates, our closest animal relatives like gorillas or chimpanzees. And they'll point out correctly that, they have these primates have brutally hierarchical social and political structures, right? There's one alpha male, and that alpha male, determines where everybody goes. It's the only one that mates with other, females. And people will say, well, look, see, in nature, this is just, it's competitive and it's, it's like this. And so this must be like without, our government systems, this is our natural state, right? Now, there's a big problem with this theory, which is that all of the evidence across, social anthropology is that, especially among primates, human beings are one of the most socially cooperative animals that exists on planet Earth. And almost, okay, maybe you could convince me that our early primate intelligence was driven by, competition and so forth. But everything that we care about as a society, things like, language and civilization and culture, all of that evolved as a direct consequence of our capacity for social intelligence. So then the question is, how did we as humans evolve differently than our gorilla and chimpanzee neighbors? And paradoxically, and I'll explain why this is the case in a moment, it appears to be the case that it actually has to do with a very unique capacity to commit violence from a distance. And I'll explain what I mean by that and why that matters, and where violence and competition, again, does have a role to play in this story. So if we look at the social systems of gorillas and chimpanzees, a lot of their political system is preserved mostly through physical hand-to-hand combat, right? And so it's very rarely there's very few cases recorded in nature of like a single individual being able to do what we would call like a political assassination of a misbehaving leader. And the reason is that, just physical strength is what's used to preserve these social systems. And so hand-to-hand combat is the dominant way that this system is preserved. Now, in humans, there's something very interesting that happened in our evolutionary past. And people always say, well, like, what's one of the biggest things that happened in evolution was the discovery of fire, which is true. Fire was a big deal. But actually, people misunderstand the development of the human shoulder blade, the very unique thing that happened in human history. So it took actually over over a million years, what happened is our collarbone lengthened. Like if you see gorilla and chimpanzee shoulders, they're rolled forward, very good for hanging from trees. They walk on all fours. And as early hominids, our early ancestors, again, this is what the anthropology is kind of pointing at, as they started to walk upright, what happened is our collarbone lengthened over about a course of like a million years. And what happened is our shoulder blade rolled out to the side. And when that happened is, for the first time, human beings became capable of overhand throwing, which when coupled with tool use became kind of the invention, at least in primates, of projectile weaponry, the ability to commit violence from a distance. Now, the reason that matters is with this development, it kind of neutralized the role of hand-to-hand combat in these like primate, gorilla systems. And so now for the first time, your social status has nothing to do with how physically strong you are. And in early hominids, what appears to be the case is that social status was correlated more with social intelligence, your capacity to work together and collaborate. And there's evidence that in early, hominid society, women, for example, had, political status, had role in these societies. And so again, it's this capacity, and again, like human beings are like one of the only animals that, again, projectile violence. So here's another paradox, which is it appears to be the case, and this is another resource that informed a lot of this research, Peter Turchin, a social scientist, that the paradox is that our capacity for social cooperation seems to have been shaped by an incredibly violent and competitive landscape of competition, except here's what Dawkins misunderstands, is that competition didn't happen at the level of the individual, it happened at the level of the group. And what Turchin and others, and this is kind of the common thinking today, is that cooperation and social intelligence became what made you more effective on the battlefield and was more likely to preserve your capacity to like survive these conflicts that existed between groups. And so, and I know this picture is just of men, but this is like societies that were like fully capable, that included women as well, of participating as a cohesive group, became more resilient and were more likely. So we're all the descendants of highly cooperative, teamwork enabled sort of early hominids. So what this means, and again, this is what Dawkins doesn't understand. It's called group level selection theory, is that at least in human primates, is that the selection didn't happen at the individual, certainly not at the level of the gene. It happened at the level of the group, where the most resilient groups were capable of displaying teamwork, cooperation, social intelligence. Actually, anthropologists argue that language was created. You think of it as like a technology for building political consensus among groups. And so then it's competition between groups that's selected for. This is where Dawkins' gene theory comes into play, right? Like we all were like inherited the gene expression of like, why that at the individual level, I'm willing to make a sacrifice that harms my particular genes or me as an individual that benefits the group. This is what we've been selected for. And I two thoughts about this. One is, I think this emerging story is really helpful for one reason, which it transcends this binary division between the political spectrums, right? Like conservatives look at liberals and they say, wow, these people are hopelessly naive about like how brutal and violent nature is. I'll come to you in a minute. Like how brutal and violent nature is. And liberals, they look at conservatives as like needlessly brutal in their obsession with security and scanning for danger all the time. And again, this emerging, the evidence is telling us a story that kind of transcends this binary division. It's of course true that nature is incredibly violent and there's competition, but in the case of humanity, human beings, it has shaped a species that is highly, highly socially cooperative. And part of the reason why I imagine Sarkar gives theory of PROUT so closely connected to the social philosophy of neo-humanism is essentially what neo-humanism is essentially it's a process of expanding your sort of social, your sort of in-group identity to expand to account for larger and larger groups, so that competition becomes less and less relevant and it becomes more and more about cooperation. And this is kind of why they kind of go together. It's not wrong. Like I think, the reason I think this is an interesting story is that conservatives, this story we're telling actually has a way of sort of like inviting in conservatives. They're not wrong. They're not wrong to say that nature is like brutal and violent, but like what it's done to us as a species is it's made us incredibly cooperative. And it's, it's a completely different social structure that we should be building around that fact. Okay, and I mentioned to the organizers, this is the kind of the warning that I'm like 5 minutes away from the close. Okay, so given all that, what does this mean practically? You might be saying like, I don't care about history. I don't care about science. Just like as a proudist, like what should we be doing? And one of the things I want to convince you is that really what we've been engaged in over the last several hundred years is, you can think of it as like a narrative war, like a narrative battlefield that, there are many ideas. And of course, we know the kind of the dominant ideas that have been pervaded across society. And how is it that happened, right? Well, it's because most of our, university systems, the way we educate our young people, has been informed by this worldview, this culture. I went to business school, and then we still get taught Milton Friedman as if it's just like normal, like regular. It's all built on totally flawed assumptions. So, given that, how does this look today? Like, how did we kind of arrive at this kind of common era that's sort of like the modern day neoliberalism that we're all sort of living under? And really, there's a whole variety of academic societies, think tanks. In some cases, entire departments at universities are funded by apparent. Like it's really ironic that when it comes to explaining their ideas, billionaires are very cooperative in funneling their money and coordinating together to kind of get everyone to sort of buy into these worldviews that are self-serving and support them. So what do they actually do? Like, what are they actually doing? Well, they're writing white papers. They're briefing members of Congress. They're, creating university curriculum. They're, doing media training. They're getting their people on television to, express their ideas so that, the common people in society are just hearing those same talking points on TV over and over again. This, by the way, is why, like, we were just, for anyone who's in Romania, like, neo-humanist education is so vital and so important to really having an impact on transforming the world we're moving into. And so I want to leave with this idea that we should feel empowered, right? Like, we in this room, unless anyone is a billionaire and I didn't know it, and we should all, come find you to write checks. Like, none of us are able to compete financially with the people that I just showed you, with these organizations that are so powerful. But there's an interesting historical anecdote, which is the invention of the printing press was a hugely transformative moment, mostly because at this moment in Western Europe, this kind of took away the monopoly that the church had in dispensing, or the Catholic Church, I believe, had in explaining their views of religion. Now anyone with an opinion online could now publish their interpretation of the Bible, and this created the Protestant Revolution. There was like a whole century of turmoil in Western Europe. And today, we're kind of living in the modern, like the digital equivalent of the invention of the printing press. Like, we should feel empowered. We have tools. I know there are people in this room who are working on podcasts, and, there are very well understood, strategic communications plans around how you like hack into culture and, change the narratives and, telling a better story. And so I want to end this presentation by, it's kind of ironic that one of these like neoliberal institutes is actually named after Adam Smith, who I mentioned at the beginning. And here's where I apologize. This is super unprofessional, but I wrote on a piece of paper because it was too much to remember this list. But I want to go back to what we misunderstand about Adam Smith. And this is, again, this is probably the thing that I learned the most in doing the research for this presentation. Again, someone who went to business school, learned about Milton Friedman. I learned to, associate Adam Smith as a beacon of, self-interest and, free markets. So as I mentioned, the first thing to know about Adam Smith, he was not an economist. He was a moral philosopher. He was very focused on what our moral obligations are to each other. And he was very clear in his work that he disagreed with Hobbes. He thought Hobbes was like kind of a dum-dum, and was very clear about that. The other thing to know about Adam Smith, so to understand Adam Smith in his own context, what he was sort of responding to was he lived in the era of what was known as mercantilism. That was like the system, which essentially was a bunch of like corporate monopolies that were forming, that were colluding with their national governments to kind of dominate society. And he was very intent on improving the lives of common people, very aligned with people in PROUT. And so that kind of informed a lot of his work. The quote that I showed you on self-interest, that's broadly taken out of context. He was actually making a point more about division of labor and people pursuing, their own passions. Is actually kind of, you could make an argument it's about cooperation. And the concept of the invisible hand that neoliberals love to invoke, it shows up one time in a 900-page book in The Wealth of Nations. It's like this really casual metaphor. He never intended it to be this dogmatic thing about, how markets work. Okay, so what did Adam Smith actually believe? And here's where, just to align with some things we know about PROUT. So one, Adam Smith advocated tremendously for the physical, mental, emotional well-being of employees. He thought that it was like the duty of employers to take care of employees in a variety of ways. Contrary to what most neoliberals would argue, he actually argued for higher wages. He was very clear that people should be able to support their livelihood based on their payment. He had this complicated set of reasons why he argued that. He was not in favor of deregulation. He actually was a huge advocate of government regulating, in particular, funding education, funding roads, bridges, infrastructure, public infrastructure. And on taxes, very clear. He wrote that the inequality of the worst kind is if the tax burden falls more heavily on the poor than the rich. Very clear on that. And the final thing, I saved this for last, the title of his book, Wealth of Nations. Most people misunderstand what that means. Most people think he was talking about how to increase the material wealth of a country. What he was actually making a point about, and he's very clear in his writing, is that when he refers to the wealth of nations, he's referring to the purchasing power of the common people. And if that sounds familiar to you, that is essentially the core objective of PROUT in this room. So I have one final, I'm very pleased to introduce, I have another video. So I want to end by, again, going back to this idea that we can now start to compete with these billionaire, think tanks and whatever, like these tools, the tools to sort of participate in this narrative battlefield we're talking about. So I went ahead, I made a video. I tried to imagine, like, what if Adam Smith could come and join us in the modern day? Like, what would he think? How would he feel? And maybe if we're lucky, maybe he'll come and join us at the PROUT convention. We'll see. I don't know. We'll find out.
I just sat through a lecture by this Milton Friedman. He misquoted me and didn't mention my work on sympathy or virtue or the impartial spectator.
This Milton Friedman just went on about human selfishness to argue for deregulation. I'm not sure what philosophy that is, but it's not mine.
Wow, this book, Atlas Shrugged, is terrible. She's taken self-interest and stripped it of every moral obligation. Hopefully this Ayn Rand person isn't well known. Why do they keep saying I celebrated selfishness? I wrote 2 books. The first one, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is about empathy.
The invisible hand was just a metaphor. I was describing how individual activity can still result in collective coordination, not this frenzy of automated greed.
They want to lower taxes for the wealthy and cut funding for education. What is this nightmare? These people should read my book. It says right here in Wealth of Nations, his wages must at least be sufficient to maintain him. Why are these gig workers paid peanuts?
These billionaire venture capitalists thinks my writing supports their worldview. I can't think of people whose ideas horrify me more. What world is this?
They actually named one of their libertarian propaganda machines after me. Please make it stop.
They've turned me into a weapon for cruelty. I wrote for balance, for dignity, for justice, for the common people.
Okay, these guys get it. There is something called PROUT, aligned exactly with my core arguments. The goal of society is to increase purchasing power for everyone. The more I learn, PROUT totally gets it. We should be able to meet the basic needs of everyone. That's the goal we're aiming for.
Block-level planning and local autonomy. Brilliant, it's brilliant. That should silence the cries of communist nanny state from our neoliberal friends.
So get this, PROUT actually adjusts itself to account for changes over time. The definition of a basic necessity is always relevant to that moment in history.
A system that restrains corporate power from dominating society? Precisely what I argued for. This PROUT sounds great. Where do I sign up?
Thank you.
Wow. Okay.